Друзья,
Distinguished friends, I would like to ask you, out of respect to those present here and to those who are waiting to be connected online, please be seated. We start. Please let me, while you are being seated, let me introduce myself. If you do not know me, I am Evgeny KISELEV. I'm a journalist, formerly director of the already mentioned today the NTV channel in Russia. For the last 15 years I have been working as a journalist mostly in Ukraine. Right now I'm a freelancer and I have my own YouTube channel. Here we have Garry KASPAROV connected online, and SNEGOVAYA, a politologist connected from New York. We also have Egor KUROPTEV from Free Russia Foundation, Yevgeniya CHIRIKOVA, a long-term Russian opposition activist. We know her from the ages of protecting the Khimkinsky forest. Anton SHEKHOVTSOV, the politologist, the member of the European Parliament, Mikhail GAHLER. He's supposed to be connected in a minute, and the well-known and very popular Oleksii ARESTOVYCH, I believe the only representative of Ukraine who is representing Ukraine on a full scale, who has joined us today. The topic of our discussion, if this is going to be a discussion, is described in general terms: war in Ukraine and Russian opposition, the EU policy on economic sanctions, and Russian opposition view. I believe that the first topic is critically more important than the second one, but this is my personal and subjective opinion. I would rather, in my brief introductory word, say that in my view, I can be wrong, but the word Ukraine has not been mentioned as frequently as I would like this to be in this room. And Leonid Gozman, our colleague, was very passionate. He was pathetic in a good way, speaking about the deficit of empathy, sympathy, and love towards our compatriots. But if we lack this, then why should we be surprised that there's a significant lack of empathy towards Ukraine and the Ukrainians? I believe this is a big and serious problem. The roots of it are well understood by me. It's not a secret, because among the political immigration community, I avoid the word opposition. If you want to say opposition, you can use this term in various anti-war movements and anti-Putin groups. There are people who are different. There are politicians, scholars, academicians of various subjects, and there are politicians who probably think of them participating in parliamentary or some other elections one day. They think about the sentiment of their potential voters, and it is probably the reason why they do not rush into saying this magic formula that has been discussed, and that has become the basis of the Berlin Declaration, that the regime is illegitimate, that the war is a crime, and the Crimea is Ukrainian. Thank you. This is what Garry KASPAROV likes speaking about quite often, and I would like to pass the floor over to him. Garry, do you copy? The floor is yours. Sorry, we do not copy. Once again, please. Do you copy? Copy, over. Evgeny, thank you for your introductory word. I believe it has been very important to say and state that the word Ukraine has not been actually mentioned today, and I wanted to punch myself to realize what year we are in. Today is June 5th, 2023. The war is going on, and there are explosives exploding, the shelling, and our country is doing this war. Certainly we can dispute about the percentage of people who support Putin or not, but the majority of the country have coped with this state of things. We can compare it to fascism in Germany in 1943 and 44. There are people who protest. We honor them and appreciate them. There are people who have been heroically resisting, and they are in prisons today, but we should understand that it is impossible to rely on domestic changes. Leonid Gazman was fair to say the words of thanks to those who hosted Russian immigration. Nobody said thanks to those who shed blood for our freedom, because no change in Russia will happen without the victory of Ukraine, and this victory is gained through blood. Therefore, we should recall the topic of today's discussion, the event that is going on, and the day after. Not 5 years after, not elections, but the day after. And again, I believe it is clear to everyone that no election can happen the next day in Russia. The current situation is clearly described by the conflict between the gangs like the Ministry of Defense, as they call themselves, and the private military company called Wagner. The war is guided by gangs, and we should not rely on the domestic changes. For a second, I would like to recall us to analyze how we come to that life. Putin's regime has been in power for 23 years, and today we could hear lots of calls. Give us money, give more money, give us tons of money, we'll resolve it, everything. But we should say that the West was quite kind. European and American institutions, various institutions, have allocated dozens of millions of dollars to support civil society in Russia. The outcome is the transformation of soft authoritarianship into dictatorship. So today we have an anecdotal example of hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars paid by US and EU taxpayers, paid for good willingness, but we should be speaking about the outcomes, and the outcome is the total failure of all democratic institutions in Russia, and trying to inject new cash into what was and has not been promising is strange. We need a strategy based on the fact that we are dealing with a war where there is no peaceful solution. We should stop all these speculations that we are for the peaceful way. We can be for anything. Changes in Russia can happen only if if Ukraine totally defeats Russia. And today we should recall that some of our compatriots, well, probably a few hundreds of people, well, right now we are talking to you, but they are fighting Putin's army in Belgrade. We know that those who are in charge of those military units, they have different views that are not our views, but there are people who are of the same blood with us. Dazin, who was in prison for his democratic opposition to the Putin's regime, he is there. And we should remember that this is also opposition, and the people who are in this room and those who are connected online, we are the opposition, but not the entire opposition to the Putin's regime. Therefore, I believe we should get to the ground and perfectly understand that there's a very narrow window of opportunities we should try to leverage. This is a call to the West. You have a powerful tool, sanctions, because nothing good after the devastation of the Putin's regime will happen overnight. It's important for the Russian community to understand that the The idea of rebuilding empire is null and void, which is proven by the very devastation of the idea, by the loss in the war, and the sanctions regime should leverage the key requirements, including giving up the military criminals to the Military International Tribunal. This is the only way to break the elites. Otherwise, this is coming from Satan, and it is senseless. If we want to have a chance for change in Russia, if we want to get back and do something, we should not be thinking about some mythical elections in 5 years. We should not be thinking about various scenarios, fantastic scenarios, that we are going to get 100 million euros more and we will impact the Russian audience. We should consider harsh realities. The country will not be ready to democracy. The majority of people supported Russia. They voted for Putin, but they perfectly understand the power of economy and strength. And if we, together with Europe and the States, realize that Russia won't be able to get rid of the sanctions unless they clear themselves from the military criminals, unless other modalities are developed to deal with those who can change sides, it's senseless to hope for any changes. Therefore, I would suggest to get rid of this smog of speculations, but we should not be thinking of rebuilding old concepts that proved to be fatal for the last 20 years. Our principle is clearly fixed. A victory of Ukraine and freedom of Russia. That's the sequence, and the victory of Ukraine is the prerequisite, but not the only condition for Russia to start having freedom. Once again, I reiterate, we are diverse people in the room, and those who are connected online, we share the same concepts and visions of the democratic Russia. Many of those who are fighting against Putin, those who are stand up against him, can disagree with us. But if we remember that victory of Ukraine and devastation of Putin's regime are primary, Churchill and Stalin was an ally. They were allies, and only military victory of Ukraine will open a historical chance for us, and Europe should get ready for that. So we should be speaking about the day after. A day after, not be speculating the fantasies about who's going to vote for whom, and to stop speaking about the sensitivity of our citizens. We do not have right to do that. We may not do that. We are an analog of fascist Germany with killing our neighbors. We will bring it we will carry it as a cross. This will be our reputation, and we should be getting rid of the expressions of sympathy that were towards Russia that we could hear from the stage today, and we should share our compassion with the victims of the Russian aggression. Thank you, Garry. If you can, please stay with us till the end of this discussion, because maybe we will have a few additional topics that will emerge. Now I would like to pass the floor to Maria SNEGOVAYA, politologist, who is connecting us from Washington, D.C. Are you connected? I believe we have a pause. This is a technical hiccup about switching the channels. I can see you. Maria, do you copy? Yes, do you copy, colleagues? Hello. Hello, Maria. Yes, we are happy to welcome you here. We are sorry for you not being here in person, but we have different situations. So the topic is simple. What should opposition do? What can a Russian opposition do? The term opposition is very alleged term. You can substitute this with political immigration community, civil society that was squeezed out of the country. So you know the synonyms. What can be done for this community to help Ukraine win the war? Or it can do nothing, or maybe it's not willing to, or not ready. So what do you think about it? I wouldn't like to be an advocate for the whole Russian opposition. I'm a politologist. I can tell you exactly what we can see from our view, and when I analyze sanctions, what works and what doesn't. It seems to me that Russian opposition, I fully agree with Garry Kasparov, should fully support Ukraine and do everything possible for Ukraine to win the war, because Ukraine is fighting not only for its freedom, but basically speaking for the international liberal order as we know it, and for the Russian future as well. Unfortunately, that's a huge burden on the shoulders of Ukraine, and our job is to try to ease this to the maximum extent, whether this is possible to do, considering that Russia is indeed the aggressor and an international criminal. I fully agree with the previous presenter. One of the tools that was introduced as the war broke, and it has been actively used by the West, is sanctions. And again, we can see that since many Russian oppositional leaders probably have this beautiful idea of being elected in the future, they still are not in concordance about the vision of the sanctions. And I believe we should fully support what is operational, which can resist the war. And what's exactly? Here I would like to refer to the topics discussed in the surveys on the efficiency of sanctions. Unfortunately, we can see that indeed these are unprecedented sanctions, and we should appreciate the Western countries, including the EU, because they had to address many difficult, convoluted issues within the last year, but not all of these things done turned to be efficient. First, we can see that the type of the regime in Russia, it's personalism and this drill to support Kremlin. The people supported. This makes the sanctions inefficient. Maybe expansion of sanctions will help, but this is not helping to split elites. There are a few options that can be harnessed in order to make this design more efficient, to expand these individual sanctions to the maximum extent. Maybe not all elites in Russia are aware how dangerous this is for them. The second option, which is widely discussed, this is to think whether there are incentives for those who are under sanctions, oligarchs or the members of the elites, for them to be able to escape sanctions. This will facilitate this design, but I would like to say that individual sanctions should be kept, because as a minimum they purify Western countries from the impact of the corrupt Putin's oligarchs. Second, the export controls. We can see a strong influence of Russia. Indeed, modern advanced technologies are hard for them to find, especially when we speak about the defense sector, then microchips, engines, bearing wheels, optical systems, and high-precision missiles. These are the challenging domains, but our recent report to CIS showed that Russia still has numerous opportunities to continue producing, although low quality but quite devastating weapons. And under the current dynamics, Russia will continue fighting and harming Ukraine for years ahead. And this is likely to be a long-term war. This is what we can see at the front line. Russia cannot move rapidly, but it can harm, and weapons supplies can help. We should appreciate Western partners for that, but more can be done, and I join Ukrainians who call to provide more weapons, to provide weapons faster. And certainly the European Union should think about long-term contracts that would enable these supplies to be permanent. We know there are numerous discussions among the weapon makers in Europe whether they can support this intensity of production long-term. we definitely should address that. We should understand that the Kremlin would not give up on Ukraine if they think that they continue harming it. And the third thing, what really works, is macroeconomic sanctions. Last year has shown that the population of Russia, the elites, will not stop supporting the war as long as they have resources, and that's the feeding ground of the regime, and we should break it because then only then we can be speaking seriously about the end of the war. Unfortunately, financial sanctions have not affected them that much, but the sanctions over Russian energy supplies are quite efficient. I mean, the oil embargo introduced by the EU in the end of last year, this hits the Russian budget significantly. We can see a significant deficit in it. Unfortunately, Russia still has resources for 1 or 2 years ahead, at least, and in order to make this design more efficient, we should, I believe, lower the price tag on oil. It is still too high, and also secondary sanctions are very important. We should recall that Russia uses various ways to bypass sanctions. So basically, these are the main reasons we would like to mention. Our common objective today is decisive victory of Ukraine and the destruction of the Crimea, and only by uniting efforts without having quarrels, only when we see our common goal, we'll be able to reach this goal. Thank you.
Ой, простите, я не нажал на кнопку, извините, ради бога. Микрофон у меня не был включен.
Sorry, my microphone was off for a while. And sorry for just one more mistake that I did from the very beginning. I did not specify the timing limitations. I think for those who have not taken the floor yet, I hope you will present your main points within 5 minutes each, so that we have an opportunity to have one more round of discussion in the concluding half an hour, and maybe even we have time for 1, 2, or 3 questions from the floor, if any. Egor KUROPTEV, representing Free Russia Foundation. Your perspective of this seemingly simple and at the same time very uneasy question: what can and what should, no, the opposite, what should and what can the Russian opposition do to help Ukraine? Thank you very much. First, I would like to say that the Russian opposition, both in Russia and outside Russia, not only can and should, it is also doing. If it's not visible, it's very sad. Probably it's our fault. In parallel, we also have to ensure the visibility, of course. But clearly, until 24th February and after the beginning of full-fledged invasion, thousands and thousands and thousands of activists don't sleep at all. This is not some heroic deed. This is maybe a duty. Maybe this is what they feel like doing for their own conscience, so that they don't have right to stop and not to waste time while your country is a terrorist, a murderer of civilians. These are dozens of counter-propaganda, huge and effective projects. It's not enough to stop the war. Of course it's not. Opposing millions of stolen money from the state budget that Putin is throwing at it, together with his administration, Prigozhin, etc. Only troll factories. $1.5 billion US dollars only for Prigozhin, but people are still fighting. The remaining grassroots groups. These are guys who, since 24th February, around the clock, work in a variety of formats, helping Ukrainian refugees. We'll say it's not enough. Of course it's not, and this is a duty. But these are dozens of thousands. There are countries where Ukrainian refugees are only helped by projects of relocated Russians, like our office in Georgia. In Georgia, the biggest organizations helping Ukrainian refugees are Russians. And I would like really to thank them. Any support 24/7, because this is kind of conscience. And it's not only there, it's also in many European countries. Many people say there are not enough protests. There are lots of protests, hundreds of protests organized by Russians. It's not a heroic deed, again. It's our duty, even for ourselves, but also to show to others in EU member states that no, not all Russians are monsters or killers, and actually there is a huge anti-war movement of Russians around the world, and also in Russia, where unfortunately people are afraid for clear reasons, because if you go to protest, you immediately go to prison. And we're not super sensitive, we don't ask for so many things, except sometimes supporting us in our struggle, such as projects, different formats, and initiatives. We only work personally. I work with 11 teams in Ukraine since 2014, and of course it was reinforced after 24th February. First of all, for counter-propaganda, but also for communications and information programs. Since January 2023, we have a coalition of 15 projects to oppose propaganda together. So if we speak the year before about Russia, of course from abroad the main thing that we can do is what? Fighting disinformation, because millions of our compatriots are in the state of brainwashed or zombified state after the effect of decades of lies. On the other hand, working with some elites to shape them, to make them tremble, to break them, to make them defect. So when we see these sanctions, hopefully they will help some oligarchs or big businesses, usually called oligarchs. They have left, or if they have not left yet, they want to connect somehow to the opposition or to the West, which would be great. So the work of the opposition, probably I will not speak about the day after, but the day before is about continuing. It's about supporting refugees, if you are good in it. It's about counter-propaganda in Russia, because your classmates or my siblings or grandparents might be watching Kiselev and lies. Not this Kiselev, I mean Dmitry Kiselev. If you don't know, there are two different Kiselevs, or they might be watching Margarita Simonyan to make it easier. And there are millions of them. All friends of mine have someone in their family or among friends who for some reason believe, or they are neutral, or they are silent, and each of us is doing something to change it, which I greatly appreciate. We frequently speak that some people are very sensitive, asking for some things. Of course, people are asking for something, but they are asking for struggle, not to get a visa, not to drink wine and do nothing, but they ask this money to fight and to help. And by the end of these 5 minutes, this is actually the first panel which is officially focusing on the war in Ukraine. So all the actions that we do, we always start with a minute of silence to respect the people of Ukraine who sacrificed their lives. So I would ask you to do this now.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. The last thing I'd like to add, I still have 30 seconds. What to do? Well, not to quarrel with each other, but to spend time on coalition building, coming together. So in national republics, Buryatia, Yakutia, Tuva, it is starting. We saw how many people were recruited from these small republics in Russia. They were mobilized to the front line because it's easier for the government, because it's easier to intimidate or bribe them, and they don't care about these voters. And they started doing something. They are starting fighting for their small republics, for their nations, to undermine the recruitment, to sabotage the mobilization. So what should we do? Consolidation, not just by establishing some joint organization, but by pooling resources and tools, and many people are doing this, but we can do it on a larger scale, and to allocate who is better in what, and then spend time and energy on being better altogether. Thank you so much. Now I'm giving the floor to Yevgeniya CHIRIKOVA. Zhenya, the floor is yours. Thank you. First of all, I would like to say thank you so much to organizers of this event. Friends, this is the first event since the beginning of the war when members of Russian anti-war movement, the people who are against Putin, speaking against him for years, have obtained this unique opportunity to speak in their native tongue about very important things. And I fully agree with Egor that we really have to see the value of anti-war movement. I've been an activist for 16 years. And this war, as Katya Schulman has said, is like a large concrete board that Putin has put on the Russian civil society. Before the war, for years, since about 2010, we, as Russian activists, were observing quite an incredible trend, which was unseen, the growth of civil society movements all around the country. If we open our activist portal, you can see the map of Russia with hundreds of dots, each dot representing some civil activities, a variety of them, environmental ranging to human rights. And right when people were starting to raise their head and feeling like they are citizens going to the elections, realizing that this government, which they had been paying for years for gas and oil, who were only enriching themselves and beating oppositionists, for the first time people realized they can say no to this. And then the war started. And from the very first day of war, I got engaged in the anti-war movement. We were the first activists in history who saw this monstrous flow of Ukrainians who were forced under guns from occupied territories of Ukraine to filtration camps, to humiliation, to horrible torture, to Russian territory, where they came and they had zero rights. And thanks to the anti-war movement, dozens of thousands of Ukrainians were saved. And this is where I see a tremendously effective work of the civil society of Russia. And you know, we had no contradictions among those who left and who stayed, because we had to save people. You know, we cannot undervalue this, because these Russian civil society activists will be the agents of change, as Natalia Arno is saying, because we have demand for democracy in Russia. We understand what we want, and we are good in organizing ourselves. We know how to do this. And yes, we do need resources. We need resources to support shelters for Ukrainian refugees around the planet, which are now being closed even in Poland, in Medyka, where Ukrainian refugees arrive every day because of these terrible Putin's shellings are continuing. One more thing I want is to still acknowledge the heroic deed of Russians who are really heroes, who joined the Ukrainian armed forces to wage war against the Russian Putin's regime. Thank you. Speaking to journalists, guys and girls, we just need to spread the word about this heroic deed. We have to say that these are our real heroes. The way how Ukrainians are good in presenting their heroes, we also have to tell the story of these great people, not to blame them that they're Nazi or fascist, that they are bad, that they take up arms, because yes, now it's time of war. And of course, I'm joining the request towards to Europeans and Western world to give Ukraine everything it means, the high precision weapons, everything they need to defend their land, and also reclaiming their occupied land. And one more very important thing to do now is to continue working with the Russian citizens inside Russia. Yes, let's face the truth. Against this propaganda which is pouring on Russians, opposing this propaganda is tremendously challenging, but we don't have to leave our citizens behind for fascists. We have to continue reaching out to them. And what's really awesome is that the activists, which were forced out of Russia by this ugly Putin's regime, the Russian activists still have their connections on the ground. And these projects to influence the people who are still in Russia, who are many and who are essential for change in Russia, we need to continue this project in every way possible and not to give your mom to fascists, so to say. It's very important, I think. To finalize my speech, I want to say thank you so much for these sanctions which are being adopted now. It's such a pity that it came so late. I remember when, together with Natalia Arnault and her team, we conducted the project against Nord Stream 2, and we did not have such a great audience in the European Parliament. We just couldn't reach the European bureaucrats, sorry for saying this, because this was a matter of policy. This was a matter of business, actually. It was not possible to stop Nord Stream 2, because Putin was a strategic partner. And now, all of a sudden, we realized that actually we had to explode it. And probably back then, someone had to listen to Russian civil society activists who demanded not to feed Putin's regime because it means the war. Because someone continued collaboration with him. Sorry, it was after annexation of Crimea. And when we speak about talking to Russians, first of all, we need to realize, everyone, this guilt that the Russian nation has, this guilt in front of Ukrainians. We have to respect this terrible grief of the Ukrainian nation. I don't think it's possible to forgive it. But I don't think we should treat Russians with disrespect, otherwise they will not be listening to us. So our task is to make others follow us. But when you start talking with insulting others, you are an orc, you are a fascist, you are a vatnik. You cannot talk to people like this. So let's learn respectful and competent communication, because our task is to organize normal democratic Russia, which will not be dangerous to the surrounding world. Thank you. I'm giving the floor to Anton SHEKHOVTSOV.
Gathered today here is not because the EU is so now much interested in democratizing Russia or in finally supporting the Russian civil society, but because of the war. I think before the war, and this is something probably that Putin did not understand, there was a growing fatigue in the West about democratization efforts outside of the traditional Western world. So in fact, I guess that Putin was wrong to think that the West was trying to conspire against his regime and Russia as such. But what the West is now doing, or what it woke up to, is not the need to democratize Russia, but the need to make Russia safe. And I think, and I would rather talk in my short presentation about the future of our relations between Ukraine and Russia, between the EU and Russia, And I'm talking about future generations. I'm talking about sometime in the future. I want also to go beyond the war. I also want to go beyond the trauma that this war caused to Ukraine. And Evgeny said that Oleksii ARESTOVYCH probably is the only person representing Ukraine fully. Well, я етнически русский громадянин України who has
I'm an ethnically Russian citizen of Ukraine.
Three identities, and I'm definitely not representing any of the countries or the blocs, but I want to talk about the future, and I want to say, you know, I'm based in Austria, as I said. Austria is a happy provincial country. It is surrounded by NATO, which means that they don't need to contribute a cent to their national security. There is two borders with Switzerland, and there is a border with the great army of Luxembourg. But otherwise, Austria is really safe. So when we are talking about these relations between Ukraine and Russia in the future, many would say that these are really elusive relations. There are many people in Ukraine who would say, well, we are not prepared to talk to any Russians at all, even if they don't support the war, even if they don't support Putin. So there are these people, and I think you will not be able to somehow remake them, to re-educate them. They are there. They're out of reach. But, as I said, I think there are people who can go beyond this trauma, who can go beyond this war. And why Ukraine needs this, why the EU needs this, is because if Austria can afford being a provincial country and not really care about their security, Ukraine and the EU, they must care about their security. And although Ukraine should pursue membership in NATO, NATO should not be enough for the national security, because the border will still be there. Even if Russia falls apart for some reason, the border will stay the same. The border will be still with Russian regions or oblasts or whatever. So Ukraine is also interested in having a safe Russia. And this, I think, not NATO membership is great, but the ultimate security framework includes a safe border with Russia. And in order to prepare for this moment in the future, or to avoid a conflict, another kinetic conflict between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, or whatever is there on the northeastern border of Ukraine, we need to influence Russian political culture. And I do believe that, although I don't think that your current work, although it is very helpful, obviously, and again, we should not denigrate somehow the work of these initiatives, I still think that this is in the framework of this small deeds theory. You know, these actions, they don't solve the strategic issues that are still there. And what I think you can still do is not only still provide help to the Russian civil society who are there, who are or who can be agents of change, but also create a new political culture where Ukraine, well, don't think that Ukraine is interested in seeing in Russia that would, you know, be extremely friendly. What Ukraine, I think, is interested is that Russia would see Ukraine as just a different country. It's not necessarily a brotherly nation, not necessarily a part of the, you know, Russian world, but just a different country that is not yours. Yeah. So this is the border. Beyond this border is a different country. This is, I think, what Ukraine ultimately wants. There can be good relations between neighbors, and there should be good relations between neighbors, because we are living in a globalized world. We need trade, and the larger market you have, it's always good in a capitalist society. So I ask you to think about creating this political culture, a new political culture that will view Ukraine as just a different country. And then I think where the EU can help is, I still believe, despite all those facts that Ukrainians find really difficult to talk to Russians, even to talk to Russians. I still believe that it's really important to somehow cooperate on some joint projects, not necessarily right now or today, it can be tomorrow or the year after. And it would really help if Ukrainians who would cooperate, potentially cooperate with Russian organizations, with Russian activists, knew that those activists subscribe to a set of really basic principles, which I would refer to, say, since we gathered here in Brussels, sort of Brussels Accord on Ukraine. And these three basic principles are that Ukraine is in the internationally recognized borders. That would be rules. Then another principle is justice. Justice means reparations. Justice means war criminals are given to a tribunal. And that also means that the third, very important, it's action, or word and action, or word and deed. This is support for the Ukrainian armed forces. You may not necessarily, send money to the Ukrainian armed forces, although I think it's still welcome, very much welcome. But what Ukrainians will definitely not tolerate is any of those discussions about our boys, all those sympathies towards Russian soldiers fighting in the war. The only sympathy that can be here and in this conversation is the sympathy towards the Ukrainian armed forces and the allies of the Ukrainian armed forces that include now also Russian citizens and citizens of other countries. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mikhail GAHLER, member of the European Parliament. Mr. GAHLER, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome also from my side. And first of all, let me thank all the organizers for this cross-party event that brings us all together today. As much as we in the European Parliament and in the European Union are united to support Ukraine, I think there is a similar big majority supporting those people who are our hope for a better Russia in future, a Russia that comes back spiritually and politically and on the people-to-people basis to a Europe that is not afraid of Russia anymore. As the standing rapporteur on Ukraine in the Parliament, not only since the start of the war, but since, I think, 2016, I can assure you that I would wish that in my lifetime I would see a Russia which has respectful relationships with Ukraine. And that is the point that you just made, Anton SHEKHOVTSOV. It's not about friendship or brotherly things, but simply to have respectful relations. And going through Europe, what countries have done to each other, even close countries. Today, there is a respectful relationship and more between Germany and Austria. There is a respectful relationship, certainly, between Sweden and Norway, although it was part of Sweden until 1905. There is a respectful relationship between Spain and Portugal, of course, although there in some part of history there were one. And I could continue these examples. I think where we need to get is indeed, and knowing as a German where we have come from, how to overcome this situation of hatred that is now existing. I think being here as a German in the European Parliament, knowing about our atrocities that we have committed to almost everybody in Europe around us, and feeling at home today in this great continent, I think it's on the one hand easy, on the other side difficult. How to get there? First, establish a democracy that enables you to admit to the full extent what you are responsible for, to apologize and ask for forgiveness, and to say never again and act accordingly. Now, as I said, I wouldn't have illusions about on the state level relationships that more than respectfulness would be achievable. But at some point, I would wish that a Russian president comes to Bucha, kneels down like Willy Brandt in Warsaw at the Ghetto Memorial and asks for forgiveness. When Russia is in such a position one day, then there is a chance, perhaps, to overcome a situation between Russia and Ukraine where we are currently. So I'm happy to see you all here, and I'm thinking what were the thinkers and those who were in exile during the war from Nazi Germany, those Germans who were in the democracies and who acted from outside into the country without the social media that we have today. Apart from the BBC in the evening on medium wave, there was no possibility for those in exile to reach out to the German public. Now I think you have better chances, although it is restricted. So I think we should think of how to acquaint a broader scope of Russian population with what is actually ongoing and what the war criminal in the Kremlin is doing to a neighboring country, or what was for a while be described as a brotherly nation. And you see how hollow, how empty this is. Either you are brothers, but then you don't kill each other. So how to get this broader? That is for me the decisive question, how to get your initiatives that are now from outside trying to reach more people in Russia, how to get a broader public and a broader sense of understanding what is ongoing, to de-zombify large parts of the Russian population. I think, first of all, it's important, of course, for you all to encourage people inside the country to overcome the fear that was described. They are all afraid of doing anything. And I think the first step is, of course, to realizing that you are not alone with your thinking. I mean, that is, I think, what the regime tries, of course, to achieve by its monopoly of the media, to give those who think differently to be in the position that they are all alone. And I think that is definitely not the case. And insofar as I see our friend here in the first row from the Endowment for Democracy, with our European Endowment for Democracy, we try with our means at some point to be supportive and to get your message over to a broader public in Russia. We will always be prepared here, I think, in the European Union at any point to respond also to the demands that you have. And if you have your best ideas how to achieve more of your, to reach more of your population, to be helpful and not to allow to denounce ourselves as anti-Russian or against the Russian people or the Russian nation or the Russian language or culture. No, that is all blatant lies from the regime. And I think we can break this mantra that the regime tries to get to its people. But the biggest role is for you to play. We cannot replace, instead of Russians, a will to return to a normal behavior as a normal state in the European continent. So rest assured, we'll be supportive of your efforts with whatever creative means, and we can serve really as accelerators and mind-setters also in a broader public, because I think as much as the rest of Europe at the time of the Second World War, during the war, was desperate about these Germans, as much we have seen as we could be accepted again and feel well. And that is what I wish the Russian nation, to be accepted at some point, to feel well again as a European nation. And that requires your steps, for which we support you full-heartedly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. GAHLER. And our next speaker is Oleksii ARESTOVYCH, former Ukrainian intelligence officer, popular blogger, and a man who in his former capacity as one of the major speakers of the Ukrainian government, became very well known as a person who was kind of a psychotherapist for the Ukrainian public, who calmed them down, who reassured them, who made the people believe that this country will eventually win the war. Alexei, the floor is yours.
Я здесь, потому что
I am here because there is no freedom of others. Freedom is our common, and unless all Russians are free, nobody can stay calm around the world. We are here in order for Russia to become free, in my view, and we should communicate. As you know, I do not present the most popular view in Ukraine about communicating with the Russian opposition and talks with Russia and Russians, because we have the heaviest emotional trauma. Many people do not want to hear anything about Russians and nothing Russian, but there are even more politicians, or there are even harsh politicians who try to exploit this topic by using this cheap populism, trying to gain political scores for the future elections, which will definitely happen one day in our country. I believe that this is a wrong view. I publicly against it in Ukraine. And I'm loved for that in semicolon. If we refer to figures, over 10 million Ukrainians have relatives in Russia. We have 800 years of common history, and I believe 8,000 years ahead, because there are no ways enabling to move Russia apart from Ukraine or vice versa. We have only land borders of 2,500 kilometers, and it's only land borders, and this situation is heavy. And I know that because I was fighting for almost 3 years, and I was one of the first who came to Bucha when there was nobody. I could see it with my bare eyes, and you can imagine the scope of information that I have. And I have 3 children, and they are exposed to these threats, and it's only about my children, and there are others, and this just adds on top of optimism and love. But we should think straight and strategically. Today, not even politicians are required, but historical figures are required. People who would think about 5, 10, 20, 50 years. Therefore, I strongly support cooperation and discussions between us, Ukrainians, and the Russian opposition for this tightest relations, because we have a common goal. This is freedom of Ukraine and Russia. We're fighting for our common freedom. This is your and our freedom. The key to the freedom of Russia is the military devastation and not the defeat. Defeat is not enough. We need a strong cure, but we need a total defeat of Putin's regime. Why? Because the reforms of China, modern China, started with China losing the Chinese and Vietnamese war in 1979, and Chinese authorities realized in 6 weeks only that nothing good will happen, and Deng Xiaoping started strong reforms. Probably Putin needs a stronger cure. Therefore, I cannot advise you. I'm not entitled to, but I can ask you. First, please support economically and politically the military campaign in Ukraine. Military defeat of the Putin's regime is the way to freedom of Russia, and that only the armed forces of Ukraine can ensure that. All military industry of NATO produces 100,000 shells of 155 millimeters, and this is what Russia shoots on us every 5 days. You should be aware of that, and 360 days only, and certainly Russia is not giving all the shells to us. Our infantry stays in trenches for 15 hours in a row, being shelled like by a heavy rain. You don't feel it. I have some knowledge of that, but I can tell you that this is a horrible experience, and this has been continuing for 17 months. the coalition plans to provide the F-16 fighters. They might be coming to the process in fall, but we will shed a lot of blood because we were not given airplanes on time, and any aircraft not given to us means hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians and children who are going to be killed. And today was the memory day, the 500 children who were murdered by Russians in Ukraine, and there are so many more in Izum and others. And Izum, there are 2 more mass graves that have not been excavated. Out of 468 bodies, only 8 of them are adult men. The rest of them are elderly people, children with tied hands. This is the price we pay for lacking weapons from the West. This is the price we pay for long political decisions. I'm sorry, I would like to take some water because I feel very difficult when talking about that. Because of that, we need weapons, and not only Ukraine needs this. This is needed to Russia for your freedom and our freedom. Third, sanctions. I have something to do with the people who are working on sanctions, and I'm working on this a little bit now. And in every rocket, in any bomb, in any drone, and Kiev got 80 missiles and 160 drones this month only. There are parts that are produced in the West. In every single drone or missile, there are parts produced in the West. In some cases, some of the parts have been supplied by 438% more than in years before. So there are companies and countries supplying that. If I give you the names of the firms or the countries that supply that, you will be surprised, because right now we go to the evidences, and I cannot give you the exact figures. This is intel, but out of all the friends of Ukraine, there are private companies from these real friends of Ukraine who supply those parts. Some of them supply directly, some of them supply indirectly, so therefore require strengthening sanctions, especially secondary sanctions, opening all the schemes, because the end user is Tier 5 and they sell, let's say, an American company, let's say, sells something to Taiwan, Taiwan supplies to Hong Kong, Hong Kong supplies somewhere else, and only then it goes to Russia. But still, it flies over our heads, and this delays the freedom of Russia. You should demand the stronger sanctions against the supplies of military weapons or double-purpose items, and common sanctions like diamonds. Diamond exports from Russia has not been suspended, and it is not a very critical industry for Russia, but only UK and the US have imposed some sanctions, but Russia gets rid of these sanctions. There was a meeting of the president of Ukraine 3 days ago with all the loyal forces about these sanctions bypassing, and we should not overlook this. And certainly we should lower the price tag for the oil. If this is the critical industry, as long as they're getting money, they will continue mobilizing Russians, and they will throw them to the Ukrainian fronts. Only this enables them to continue this, and there will be no even sign of elite split. And I would like to ask you about the third thing. This will sound harsh, but please understand me correctly. Please make peace between yourselves. I've been talking a lot to the representatives of Russian opposition, and when I hear the second sentence from them, they start complaining about the other oppositionists, and I cannot manage to talk about anything else. The problem is that I dare to be speaking as a person who likes psychology for many years. For the majority of those who I'm talking to, these are the sub-threshold things. Anton has been speaking about a new political culture, and I would like to dive deeper into this, because you do not mention, you are not aware of the other type of culture, like dominating and control. When you talk to each other, I can see it from the side, you always want to win, you want to be correct, right, you want to control communications, etc. Open democratic Russia that we are building should be based on other principles of communication and cooperation. These are the key principles of the humanity. It was verbalized in the French Parliament in the 18th century. It sounded, if I'm correct, I fully disagree with you, but I'm ready to die for your freedom to express your thoughts in order to disagree with me. To say this in person, this is the main principle of parliamentarism. Open society means to be able to work with a person who hates you, with whom you have a bad common past, whom you dislike, and with whom you fully disagree. But if you have a common goal, let's say open democratic Russia, this is a good ground. Enough ground to work together. In your future Russian parliament, you will be seated with the people who you do not really like. You will have to adopt laws which will get back Russia to the global community, to the global division of powers and labor. You will continue disliking one another, but you will have to be working for the sake of your homeland. I believe that now, when we are not in the future parliament, still, it is a good time to exercise, to do that. This is what I ask you to do. I cannot demand this. I'd like to ask you about the fourth. Please support the Russian militarized opposition, which is in Belgorod Oblast and RBK and others. I understand that many of you do not find this a good idea, and you believe that they are opportunists and fascists. But I'm telling you that only adventurous people can do that, because the soldiers of Ukraine, of course, all of them are heroes. But please imagine a Russian soldier of the military opposition. You compromised your relatives, yourself. You are. They take larger risks and they risk everything in their own country. These are the people who are of polar views, but these are Russian citizens who shed blood for the freedom of Russia. We are talking to you, and they are dying at the same time for the freedom of Russia. And I cannot give you advice, as I cannot even ask you to unite with them. However, I can support this idea, for example, the declaration of mutual support, but at least do not prosecute them, do not criticize them, support them. Why? Maybe you do not see this from the side, but I can tell you how we see this through our optics. When a wise law enforcer in Russia, there's a wise oligarch in Russia looks for an alternative. Where this alternative is, there is no alternative. And now look, on the one hand, we have the political opposition in Europe, and we have the militarized opposition that is fighting the Russian one. These are all Russian citizens. In fact, political representation plus military representation, well, they have uniforms, they report, they comply with all international requirements on war and conflicts. These are the signs of statehood, and I'm sorry for putting it this way. These are the signs of political representation, alternative political representation with their media, with their military system. And the military raid in Belgorod Oblast is operative and tactic, but they have a huge and ideological and tactical importance, because when they were fighting Putin troops for the first time, today we cannot call the Russian troops the Russian troops. The Russian Federation has another army. We should be saying Putin's army, and there is another army of the region of Free Russian and RDK. This is a new army of the Russian Federation. Do you know how they fight? They fight totally different from the from the Putin's army. When the Putin's army started using the TOS-1 shelling system against Russian citizens, they were throwing bombs. The freedom of Russia left this area in order for Russian citizens not to die, and nobody died. They protect their own citizens. They cover them, unlike Putin's army, which is ready to buy its own citizens. So there's another second Russian army. It fights following other principles. This is the European army. This is the European country. This is the basis for Russia to get back to the civilized family of nations. And one more thing I would like to ask you about, or a comment from my side. For the new future, you need a new past. This is very simple psychological idea. A person cannot build a new historical future, a new society, new nation if you have no new past. We should give this new past to the Russians who are cheated, who are under the influence of the towers of Kremlin. But once they wake up, they will have to look back, and it will be critically important for them to be talked to, saying that we have informed you, we gave you the truth. This will be this will be the seed for them to be sorry. Like we heard this, but we did not listen, and this will be the seed of New Russia. I'm not saying that they should stand on their knees and say we're sorry, but this is a psychological chance for these people to resurrect and to reborn, because many of them hesitate. The most widespread position in Russia, we have our hidden surveys done in Russia. Yeah, they say Putin is an asshole, but Russia cannot afford itself losing. This is a dangerous position occupied by many people. We should be saying that it's not Russia, but Putin's regime is losing, and that the purpose is to destroy the Putin's regime, not Russia. We have a few hotlines at our headquarters and talking to Russian soldiers, enabling them to come to Ukraine, that they are protected by the Geneva Convention, and they can join the Russian units in the Ukrainian army. And 1/4 of them are those who used to shoot our citizens, and their personal fate shows that a Russian soldier, and my grandfather was a Russian soldier, he was the hero of the Second World War. He was working in intelligence, and intels usually die, and he was there for 4 years. So these people in a new system, being inspired by the new political idea or by the new political culture, can become different. They used to kill us in March, and today they're fighting for us and for the freedom of Russia. This is possible. We should give people a chance. We should accept them. You should find a suitable form for you and stretch a hand of help to them. And in the end, you will have to develop this new political culture. And I believe that the development of this new political culture is an objective number 1 for today, including sanctions and all the other things that I've mentioned before. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Oleksii. I have to admit that I did not think I was entitled to limit his speech, and I believe that the members of the panel support me and understand me. We have just 5 minutes left for brief comments. Eugene?
Буквально там 30 секунд.
Скорейшей победы.
About 30 seconds. The quickest victory of Ukraine.
What did you just say?
The quickest victory of Ukraine.
One final summary. Well, when it's about Ukraine, we will support them as long as it takes for them to win the war. And then in the reconstruction and in the preparatory phase for membership in the European Union, we will do our utmost. Well, combining these two processes, reconstruction and path to the European Union, we will see to it that these two processes go well hand in hand, that we overcome the practices of the past, all those things why the Ukrainians went to the Maidan twice because of previous deficits of their own leaderships. All that what the Ukrainians inspire and would aspire for, we will be helpful to achieve that as soon as possible, and we will be loyal supporters in this regard, but we will also be strict. That is why I'm on the one hand. That is why I'm so much in favor of an early start of accession negotiations, because that gives us also the leverage to come in at any point when we have the feeling that certain things go in the wrong direction. Because the bad guys have not totally disappeared. They were there before. They are still there, perhaps a bit silent. but there is no return to old habits. Ukraine has been aggressed by Putin because they are on the way to a normally functioning democracy. And this path that has been now interrupted by this dreadful war will be continued, and it will be successful. And this Ukraine will also serve as a wonderful example how a future Russia could be as a democracy, as an open society, where the resources of the country is used for the benefit of the people, of its citizens, and not for this clique of who enrich themselves. I think a good example of a future Ukraine is really the best that can happen to Russia, to have such a neighbor in future. And in this regard, let us all work together across the parties, and at the same time not forget about those Russians like you who also strive and fight for a better Russia. You also deserve it. Your whole nation deserves it.
По удаленной связи сейчас я передаю слово Гарри Каспарову.
Now remotely I'm giving the floor to Garry Kasparov for his last comment. It's not the last plea, it's the last comment. I think very important words were said from Oleksii ARESTOVYCH about alternative legitimacy, that only such measures will enable to distinguish in the thinking of the entire world and Ukrainians Putin's troops, Putin's crimes, and the Russian citizens. Drawing the parallel with the previous war, we heard the voice of Free France. Few had heard about de Gaulle. It was all based on the certainty of Churchill that it had to be done. And I think that the people who are represented in this room can represent Russia much better than de Gaulle in 1940. So whom we need now is collective Churchill in the West, who might understand that only by creating the alternative we can finally focus the efforts of the entire world on the main goal, which is the collapse of the Putin's regime and return of Russia to the family of civilized nations. Thank you, Garry. Egor?
Thanks a lot for hosting this event, for organizing it. The name of this event is very, very important for all Russian anti-war movement, community, dialogue between European Parliament and pro-democratic Russians. Acknowledgement of Russian anti-war movement is very important for us. And Ukraine will definitely win, and we Russians will have to win in Russia after. And we need you, and you need us. Because you cannot build a wall around Russia, it's not possible. And we cannot fight without your help, assistance, as a unity. So we need unity with the entire democratic community, United States, European Union. Let's fight together, please. Thanks a lot.
Talking about a possible democratic Russia or a safe Russia, we should not be discouraged by the current weakness of pro-democratic activists, of the pro-democracy Russians. Because in the end, the EU and Ukraine should invest into this vision of a safe Russia. Probably it would be better to have a democratic Russia, but safe would be just enough for some time. Should invest resources, network resources, human resources into making Russia safe again. And whatever the cost we pay in order to do this, in order to exert this influence, this cost is still lower than a cost of a possible another kinetic conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And I will finish by saying Slava Ukraini.
Пожалуйста, Мария, вам минута на подведение итогов.
Maria, 1 minute for you to summarize. Yes, colleagues, I agree with the previous points. In particular, I would support Oleksii ARESTOVYCH. This is a huge responsibility for all of us Russians for the years to come, given the things which are being done by Russians, also our friends and colleagues in Ukraine. We cannot live normally as long as it continues. Unfortunately, we will be sealed by these events for many years, and we have to do whatever we can to stop and prevent further crimes. And of course, more sanctions, more weapons to Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine, glory to Ukrainian heroes. I must tell you, dear friends, that probably with 2 or 3 friends of mine from Ukraine, I have discussed this upcoming trip to Brussels, and they all told me roughly the same thing. If, Evgeny, you have any chance to say it, please ask all representatives of different groups and movements of the Russian emigration, the Russian opposition, or Russian anti-Putin and anti-war movement to support the brave and courageous, well, this might be adventurous people who are fighting in the Legion of Free Russia and the Voluntary Corps of Russia, fighting on the side of Ukraine, making these courageous trips to Belgorod, the Belgorod region, no matter what they had done in the past. This is what I had to say while I'm giving the last floor to Oleksii ARESTOVYCH. Please complete this panel. Thank you for your trust, but I have already delivered my point. The only thing I can add that, you know, when I was going to speak in front of the office on the first day when the war started, when I had to speak to the media and to the people and the world, I didn't know if I would be alive hours later. My feeling was that this was the last speech in my life for quite a long time, because as a military person I can say that the situation is quite challenging. Only by 3rd or 4th March I believed that we would survive. Before that I did not believe that we would. But we had to do our job, and we did. And as someone who was thinking about addressing the need to psychologically support a huge number of people in Ukraine and those supporting Ukraine, I found some childish solution to this very adult task. We always have to put stake on the light. I'm saying this as someone who worked in security services, in wars. We always have to believe in light. In personal communication, in strategizing, and in historical decisions, we always have to put stake on the light. And what is the light? If I see someone standing in front of me, regardless of their gender, age, or political belief, for example, in someone who is in the Russian opposition standing in front of me, we should see the better version of themselves, the best version of themselves. And I hope that we take the best version of ourselves from this forum after the 2 days, the version of new Russia. I believe that Russia can be different. I see the different Russia in yourselves. I see the better Russians in the Russians fighting on the side of Ukraine. I can see a lot of better people in Russia, and the nation should be judged by its best representatives, not by its worst ones. This is the old truth, and I think that in its development Russia can be an awesome country with great people, the decoration of the humankind. So let's work together to make it happen, putting stake at the light.
За небольшую задержку.
Thank you so much to everyone. Sorry for a small delay.